everyone, welcome back to Alice on the Giant Bookshelf, and today is the Victober special, a reader's guide to Sherlock Holmes. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. Today's video is a bit different from my usual content because it is part of my series A Reader's Guide to. And in this series I'm going to be talking about some of my favourite characters and book series, and the previous video, the first one in the series, was about Jack Reacher from the Lee Child thrillers. And today's video, as it's Victober, is a Victober special all about the one and only Sherlock Holmes. Now, Sherlock Holmes needs no introduction really. He's an incredibly famous creation by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Today I am wearing my brand new Sherlock Holmes t-shirt that I bought from Spinster's Library, and it's The Game is Afoot Sherlock Holmes t-shirt with Holmes and Watson as cats. Big shout out to Spinster's Library. I absolutely love this t-shirt design, and I definitely would have bought the hoodie if I'd have realised how cold it was going to be by the time I filmed my video. So I'm wearing my Game is Afoot t-shirt. I'm ready to tell you all about one of my favourite characters of all time, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. In this video I'm going to be covering for you who is Sherlock Holmes, who else is important in these books, a bit of a timeline of the books and the stories. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of the books. We're going to talk a little bit about adaptations, of which there are many, and after all of that we will talk about where to start with Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the star of 4 novels and 56 short stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and they were all published between 1887 and 1927. And before we get into who Sherlock Holmes is, I would just like to start by saying that I have been into the Sherlock Holmes books since I was very young. My mum used to read me and my brother the short stories when we were younger, and I've never looked back from there. I have read these books myself, and I've also listened to them on audiobook quite recently. So let's start at the beginning. Who is Sherlock Holmes? Sherlock Holmes, if you haven't heard of him yet, is a famous fictional detective created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He's a mastermind in the art and science of deduction, and he describes himself as a consulting detective. He is known for his powers of observation, which he uses to deduce things about the people he meets and the cases he encounters. A very famous quote by Sherlock Holmes is, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." Sherlock Holmes's books and stories are primarily set in Victorian London, although some do take place in Edwardian times. Sherlock is a complex character who is untidy and fond of smoking his pipe and playing the violin. He's prone to bouts of drug use, particularly cocaine, and sometimes he appears to be very manic when working on cases, and without cases to try his intellect, he becomes very easily bored and even perhaps depressed. We can't really talk about Sherlock Holmes without mentioning who else is important in this series, and the most important of them all is of course Dr. John Watson. Dr. Watson is Sherlock Holmes's famous sidekick. He's absolutely central to the books and the stories because most of them are narrated by him. There are actually only 4 of the short stories that are not narrated by Watson, 2 that are narrated by Holmes himself and 2 that are told in the third person. Everything else is first person perspective from the pen of Dr. Watson. Watson meets Holmes in A Study in Scarlet, the first novel, and from then on he chronicles Holmes's adventures. Watson is intelligent but of course cannot match up to his friend's deductive powers. He's very much a character that Holmes uses to help his own mental processes. Holmes and Watson are introduced by a mutual friend as they both need to share a flat, and they end up living together at 221B Baker Street in London. They live at this address during many of the stories, although there are times when they live apart as well. Watson has a medical degree and he trained as a surgeon in the British Army. He was wounded in 1880, he suffered a fever and was sent back to England in poor health, and it's after this that he meets up with and moves in with Sherlock Holmes. Watson acts as a biographer of sorts for Holmes, and Watson, of course, is the inspiration for many other sidekicks in crime and mystery since the Victorian times, including famously Agatha Christie's Captain Hastings, who was the sidekick to Hercule Poirot in some of her books. There's a lot of characters who take on the Watson role in other books. Some other characters that appear in the Holmes series that aren't quite as important as Holmes and Watson themselves are Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft is Sherlock's older brother, and he's described as extremely large and lazy, but he is in fact actually even more of a genius than Sherlock. He helped to found a club called the Diogenes Club, where you can go and sit in complete silence. The club's rule is silence at all times. And it seems from the books that Mycroft seems to spend most of his time at the Diogenes Club sitting in silence. We also encounter Scotland Yard Inspector Lestrade, who frequently has to ask Sherlock Holmes' assistance in cases where he and the police are otherwise baffled. Holmes' biggest nemesis is, of course, Professor James Moriarty, who Holmes describes as the Napoleon of crime. He is a villain that Holmes faces in The Final Problem, and he's also mentioned in 5 other stories, and he briefly appears in the novel The Valley of Fear. Moriarty is a criminal mastermind who aids criminals but does not actually commit the crimes himself. Another character that we meet along the way is Mrs. Hudson. She is Holmes and Watson's landlady at 221B Baker Street. Another female character in the books is Irene Adler. Irene Adler appears in only one story, A Scandal in Bohemia, but she's referred to by Holmes himself as the woman. She is mentioned in a few other stories. Another group of characters that are mentioned multiple times in Sherlock Holmes are the Baker Street Irregulars. This is a group of street boys who are frequently employed by Holmes to gather intelligence for him. On to the timeline of the books and stories. So, the publication order of the books is A Study in Scarlet, which was published in 1887, The Sign of Four, which was published in 1890, those are both novels, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, published in 1892, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, published in 1894, both of which are short story collections. The Hound of the Baskervilles appeared in 1901 to 1902, followed by The Return of Sherlock Holmes in 1905, another short story collection. The final novel published was The Valley of Fear, which was published in 1914 to 15, and then came His Last Bow in 1917, and The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes followed in 1927. So, those are the novels and the collected short stories, and that is the publication order. However, the actual timeline chronologically is very different and difficult to pin down, as many of the short stories are set in different time frames or much earlier. In terms of when the novels are set, A Study in Scarlet takes place first and is set in 1881. The final novel to be published, The Valley of Fear, takes place next chronologically. The Sign of Four comes third in the chronology. The Hound of the Baskervilles is the final novel chronologically. Interspersed in between these novels are the short stories, and these would need a whole video on their own. The stories from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes are largely set in between the novels in terms of timeline, mostly before The Hound of the Baskervilles. There are a couple of stories just to mention, but obviously I can't mention every single short story. There are 2 short stories that are definitely set prior to A Study in Scarlet, as they are stories told by Holmes to Watson. The Adventure of the Gloria Scott and The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual, both of which are featured in the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. These are both set prior to Holmes and Watson meeting. Now, at this point, if you've never read or heard much about Sherlock Holmes, I am about to mention a spoiler. It is a fairly well-known spoiler, but if you do not want to hear any spoilers at all about the Holmes canon, skip forward 30 seconds or cover your ears. We're going to talk about 2 key stories and a major event, so please skip this part if you want to miss all spoilers about Sherlock Holmes. If you're okay with a spoiler that is pretty widely known, then keep watching. I'm about to mention the spoiler now. So, in The Final Problem, Fed up with writing about Holmes and feeling that the Holmes stories hindered him creatively, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote of Sherlock Holmes's death at the hands of an enemy. This famously caused such an outpouring of grief and did nothing to stop the public wanting more of Holmes. So in the story The Adventure of the Empty House, Holmes returned and his supposed death was explained away. Most stories in The Return of Sherlock Holmes are set after the final problem, whereas all of the stories in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes are set prior to the final problem. Okay, if you wanted to avoid the spoilers, welcome back. Two of Sherlock Holmes' latest adventures, both set in the 1900s, are The Adventure of the Lion's Mane, which features in the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, and His Last Bow, which is in the collection titled His Last Bow. The Adventure of the Lion's Mane is particularly notable because it was narrated by Holmes himself, and His Last Bow was notable for being narrated in the third person. So, we've got past the chronology, I think. Hopefully that made sense. Let's look at the books and I'll tell you a little bit about each, and I'm going to do that in publication order for ease. So, we start with A Study in Scarlet. In A Study in Scarlet, Holmes and Watson are introduced and solve their first case together. Half the book relates to their solving of the mystery and half is set in Mormon America, explaining the motives of the murderer. The Sign of Four, the second novel of Sherlock Holmes, involves mysterious pearls which have been sent to a woman over the years, and she has just received a mysterious note. Holmes and Watson help her to seek out her benefactor, and in doing so they become involved in an even darker problem. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes is the first short story collection, and it contains 12 mysteries, including some absolute favourites, such as A Scandal in Bohemia, where Holmes meets Irene Adler, The Red-Headed League, The Five Orange Pips, The Man with the Twisted Lip, and my personal favourite, The Speckled Band, which is so eerie and frightening. The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes contains 11 more short stories, including some very famous ones such as Silver Blaze, The Musgrave Ritual, and The Final Problem. The Hound of the Baskervilles is considered Arthur Conan Doyle's finest work by many, and in this one Holmes investigates a fearsome and ghostly hound and a mysterious death said to be the result of the cursed dog. This one takes place in the wild countryside and on the moors in Devon. The Return of Sherlock Holmes collects 13 more short stories, picking up where the final problem left off. Notable stories in this one are The Empty House, The Dancing Men, The Six Napoleons, and The Second Stain. The Valley of Fear was the final novel to appear, but is set before the previous two, and it involves an early encounter with Professor Moriarty and another half of a book devoted to explaining a backstory set in America. This one involves a secretive society. Now, the final two books I have as one collection. His Last Bow contains 8 short stories, including the last of Holmes' cases, His Last Bow. The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes contains 12 short stories, including 2 narrated by Holmes himself, The Adventure of the Blanched Soldier and The Adventure of the Lion's Mane. The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes is definitely set before His Last Bow. So, that's all the books and short story collections that we have. Let's talk about adaptations. Holmes and Watson have been immortalised in too many adaptations to mention them all here. Do let me know in the comments down below. Do you have a favourite adaptation of Sherlock Holmes? And if you do, can you tell me whether you are a Sherlock Holmes reader as well, or whether you just like this particular adaptation? Some of the more notable ones are the Basil Rathbone films, which were made between 1938 and 1946. Basil Rathbone is one of the most famous portrayals of Sherlock Holmes. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes TV series, starring Jeremy Brett as Holmes, were made in the 1980s and 1990s, and these ones are pretty faithful to the books. A recent film adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, well, relatively recent, was released in 2009 with a sequel in 2011. This one stars Jude Law as Watson and had Robert Downey Jr. playing Sherlock Holmes. This one isn't particularly faithful to the books and it depicts Holmes as more of an action hero, so it was still good. I enjoy adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, even if they're very different. Speaking of very different, there was also a series set in modern day New York with a modern day Holmes played by Johnny Lee Miller, with Lucy Liu as Joan Watson. This one was called Elementary, and as you can tell from the description, it's pretty far removed from the original source material. My personal favourite adaptation, even though it isn't that faithful to the books, is the BBC's Sherlock. This was from 2010 to 2017 and featured Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes and Martin Freeman as Watson. This one was set in modern day London, and it's my personal favourite because I like spotting the references to the books. It did get quite ridiculous in the later series though, but I still enjoy it, and I do enjoy a good rewatch of Sherlock from time to time. Hi Harry. Where to start with Sherlock Holmes? The beauty of Holmes is you can pretty much read it in any order you choose. And the short stories are great to get a flavour of Holmes and Watson. You can dip in and out of them. If you want to start at the beginning and read in order of publication, you can. If you're intent on doing that, I highly recommend the Sherlock Holmes collection on Audible. This is narrated by Stephen Fry. Fry is a huge fan of the stories, and he gives us a lot of interesting information before each of the books when he introduces them. I really enjoyed this as an audiobook, and that was my most recent experience of the whole works of Sherlock Holmes. My personal choices for starting points would be to either start with The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, especially if you like short stories. In my opinion, these ones are the best, although some of the stories in the memoirs are great too. If you wanted to start with the best novel, or you think you might not read them all, I recommend starting with The Hound of the Baskervilles. This one for me is head and shoulders above all the other novels, which all three of them seem to be split into mystery and backstory, whereas this one is not. If you want to get to meet Holmes and Watson at the beginning though, and you want to know more of their methods before reading The Hound, I would go for A Study in Scarlet first to get an idea of their relationship first and to be there at their first meeting, or read some of the adventures to get a grounding in their adventures and their rapport together before you then read The Hound. The Hound of the Baskervilles is definitely one not to be missed, so I do recommend reading this one at some point, whatever you do. If you wanted to read the novels chronologically, then as we've already said, you would need to start at A Study in Scarlet, but you would then need to read them out of publication order and read The Valley of Fear, followed by The Sign of Four, and then The Hound. I personally think the short stories add a lot more. It might be because the short stories were my first exposure to Sherlock Holmes, and in some cases, especially in the adventures, I think the short stories are much better than some of the novels, excluding The Hound of the Baskervilles. So if you're not planning to read all of Sherlock Holmes, I definitely would suggest checking out at least some of the short stories. My favourites are probably, from this collection, The Speckled Band, A Scandal in Bohemia, The Red-Headed League is one I'm very fond of, and from the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, of course, you would need to read The Final Problem, and that story is definitely one of my favourites too. But there are so many good short stories, we would need another whole video to go into all of them, so I urge you to try some of the short stories, maybe start at the beginning with those, but whether you're planning to read the novels or not, definitely do try some of the short stories, because I don't think you'll be sorry that you've tried out some Sherlock Holmes. If you are not here because you are a book lover, I do recommend the series Sherlock if you'd like to watch a pretty eccentric reimagining of Sherlock Holmes, and I do recommend the Jeremy Brett series if you want to watch a very faithful adaptation of the Victorian feel of the books. So that was Sherlock Holmes in as small of a nutshell as I can manage. I hope you've enjoyed finding out a little bit more about the world's only consulting detective with me. I hope on the back of this book you will give some Sherlock Holmes a try, and if you do, please let me know in the comments down below which story or novel you think you're going to try first. If you have read Sherlock Holmes before, do let me know in the comments down below which is your favourite short story or favourite novel. And do let me know in the comments down below if you have any more characters you would like me to cover in my Reader's Guide to series. I will be making some more of these videos eventually. This was the Victober special, a Reader's Guide to Sherlock Holmes. I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and if you have, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up, and I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. I do talk about books here on BookTube on a very regular basis, so I would love to have you join me again soon for another video. all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.